time and change. Note, lore details in this chapter and onward are based loosely on fellow Fallout fanfiction writer XCOM Anders and his take on what a post-New Vegas world in Legion would possibly look like. This said, what you read below is no longer strictly inspired by the canonical so much as the possible. Either way, I hope y'all enjoy. Caesar's death was the synthesis of his creation's thesis and his ambition's antithesis. Edward Sallow, or Caesar, was one of the smartest men of his day when it came to his knowledge of history and his ability to use that history to construct a powerful society like the Legion. Although knowledge is not the same as wisdom, because as smart, terrifying, and powerful as he was, the society he created was one that could only be truly united by he himself. This is something he could not have foreseen through the fog around his focus on the Mojave. Caesar's legacy was a nation built by being more violent and terrible than the world it was born in. But he couldn't leave himself behind as the great unifier in a world that would later purge him from it. His death would go on to spawn two types of men in the Legion, those who were devoted entirely to the ideals of terror or brutal civilization at any cost, as well as those who saw him as the sole entity of supreme devotion. Although the Legion without Caesar would continue on, there were so many that could not bear a world where Ozymandias would become nothing more than a monument that would only be buried by the sands of time. Both Alaron and Montano loved Caesar, but what happened after the great fracture in Legion power would only be determined after the legends of old found new light in the new world without their emperor. Caesar's death would only mean that the name Caesar and all the glory and honor associated with it was even more worth fighting for. If not to bring more power to the mortal man, then to bring honor to the lasting creation of that name and everything that creation lorded over. Alaron. How Lord Caesar died exactly remains mired in the messiness of that era. The specific events around the final stages of the Legion's Mojave campaign is one of the most unreliable pieces of Legion history, especially after the arrival of the famous individual known as the Courier. Why this is exactly remains somewhat unknown, but stories about Caesar's death talk of so many things that cannot be verified. Some have said that the Courier personally orchestrated the death of Caesar when tasked to heal his brain tumor. Some stories say that the Courier even battled their way through the entirety of Fortification Hill until eliminating Caesar in his own tent. Then there are others who say that Caesar got healed by other means and later died sometime after the campaign. Either way, the way that Caesar died didn't particularly matter when the end result of the campaign was the same. Although even the exact date of the Second Battle of Hoover Dam also remains unverified. It is believed to have occurred sometime during the beginning days of 2282 or final days of 2281. Still, when the battle finally came, it changed the Legion fundamentally, just as predicted, but not in the way anyone expected, especially Alaron. Weeks after Falco returned from his partially failed raid on Bitter Springs refugee camp, Legatus Lanius arrived on the Mojave front, and his arrival signaled the start of the second battle at the dam. With the arrival of Lanius and all the forces he brought from the east, including the first cohort, made entirely of centurions, Alaron was handed his role in the battle. Lucius knew of Alaron's mind and knew even more of his reliability in battle, and so Alaron was enlightened even more about the grand nature of the final battle. Adorned in his centurion battlefield attire, Alaron and all the other commanders of the Legion threw aside any notions of blending into the ranks and marched into the final battle, ready to die for Caesar with everything that signified their honorable service across the east. Just before dawn had come on that famous day, Alaron was sent on a massive flotilla of soldiers across Lake Mead toward the primary NCR encampment in the north known as Camp Gulf. By the time dawn broke over the east, Lanius had stormed the dam, while the reserves across the lakeside encampment swarmed the excavated intake tunnels into the heart of the dam, with the first cohort of legendary centurions leading the way. The battle at the dam began above the structure as well as within, and the work painted the entire structure in more blood than the first time. At the same time, the terror forces across the south were bolstered with even more reserves who washed across the south like a tidal wave of crimson. Lucius was right when he told Alaron about the utmost force that would be used to win this battle, because the second assault on the dam wasn't just the battle at the dam, it was the battle for the Mojave. Using a three-pronged approach, Forlorn Hope faced the vicious hordes of the south, and while the concrete dam was painted in blood, so was the north. When the sun had risen, Alaron and his cohort in the north had landed on the north shores of Lake Mead and began their assault on the NCR's heavily fortified Camp Golf. All the while, every contingency that survived the courier's intervention was acted upon within Vegas and the surrounding region, causing an enormous frenzy for survival the territory hadn't seen since being saturated in the nuclear fires of 2077. With Vegas and every populated area from the Colorado River to the California border up in flames, the Legion's assault continued throughout the day. The elite Centurion in charge of the northern invasion was killed in the third hour of the assault on Camp Golf, but the fight continued. The soldiers of California continued to fall as the Ranger headquarters withstood the ensuing siege for hours afterward. All the while, the Legion defended against endless counterattacks from McCarran and other NCR installations, while the chaos atop the dam continued. As successful as the assault on Camp Golf was, it remained an ongoing battle throughout the day, and it was more than costly as NCR forces continued to pound their position. Hours into the battle, and Alaron had no idea whether or not the battle across the south or battle on the dam was going well. The thunder of guns continued to roar across the entire Mojave as the smoke of so much conflict blanketed the region. With no way to determine success, Alaron's attention was completely focused on the endless counterattacks, while the Rangers in the resort building continued to fight. Room by room, the Rangers in their headquarters were annihilated, leaving dozens of dead legionaries in the wake of their struggle, and eventually, the afternoon arrived. Suddenly, at some point in the mid to late afternoon after hours of fighting, Alaron pulled his blade out of a trooper's stomach and began directing his forces against the west when he saw the resort wrapped in flame. The black smoke billowed into the sky, and more mortars and machine guns thundered across the northern advance until his attention turned to the south, and his hearing returned just in time to hear the message coming from a fallen explorer's radio pack. Amidst the mutilated corpses and ongoing savagery, the message he heard froze his blood, making him turn his eyes to the towering fortification hill. The smoke of burning debris and dust of chaos subsided just for a moment so Alaron could see it. Alaron watched a dozen rockets shoot into the air above the fort, leaving their wide trails spiraling across the sky above the distant fortress, and the message he overheard made sense. His mind echoed with the call to retreat he heard during the first battle, and there he saw the speck in the air dropping a stream of dots upon the dam in the south. The dam top was wrapped in an inferno as incendiary bombs fell upon the dam, and more missiles spiraled into the sky atop the fort, as the entirety of Fortification Hill too was set alight. If he didn't believe the radio message saying Caesar was in danger when he heard it, he did when he saw what was happening across the dam. Completely panicked, Alaron didn't know what to do. There was no way to return to the fort in time to aid Caesar, and any diversion in attention away from the NCR's continual counterattack meant death. Alaron concluded that this was it, and just then, the next Legion radio message came from the fallen explorers pack saying, "All Legion forces are to die to the last man." Alaron panicked momentarily but agreed with the message and turned to the next wave of NCR forces in the west, when almost immediately, the next message came in saying, "All surviving cohorts fall back to the fort. Protect the legate. Caesar's status is unknown." With the two conflicting orders, Alaron was lost, seeing more legionaries die as the fire engulfing the resort building grew. Another veteran centurion took charge of the surviving cohort, saying it was now or never. It was time to give their all for Caesar, who may or may not have still been alive by this point. However, right there in that moment, Alaron remembered what Lucius had told him, and more importantly, what he himself told Falco. Whether Caesar lived or died in the aftermath of this battle, the Legion needed to continue, and Alaron was more than ready to face crucifixion for what he would do next if it meant the Legion would continue. In the heat of battle, Falco saw this internal struggle on his commander's face and knew what Alaron needed to do, while also knowing what that other centurion intended. Before the other centurion could rally the surviving officers and order the entire line to charge suicidally into the NCR's next counterattack, Falco is said to have left a primed grenade next to the commander's feet. As the limbs of this other commander were carried away into a bloody mist, he could have just as easily been hit by an NCR mortar, and the command seat was open once more. Falco screamed at his commander, "Sire, what shall we do?" Alaron watched his senior staff officer eliminate the veteran centurion, but his mind was too mired in what he should do to make anything of it. However, Alaron's draft into the seat of command by his veteran Decanus shook him back into action with full instinctive clarity for him to shout in return. "We are falling back. Rally all commanders on me for return to the rafts." Alaron never quite forgave himself for doing the only sensible action in the chaos of the Mojave's final battle. Alaron was ready to be crucified for his ordered withdrawal if the Legion won the day. But what was shown atop the dam and fortification hill said that he made the right call as the 200 survivors of the enormous northern flank returned. Upon reaching the shores of the lakeside encampment, the stray force came under fire from mechanical-looking nightmares, barely able to be discerned through the dust and fires across the old fort. By the time night fell, the Legion's forces were scattered, and the survivors of the Camp Golf assault drifted to the furthest eastern part of Lake Mead. Rallying with the other stray forces that were pushed out of Fortification Hill, none of the reports they heard were reliable at all. Where Caesar was, if he was alive, where report in next, none of those questions were answered as the night got darker and darker. Word eventually came to all these stray groups that the legate was alive, and it was he who rallied the surviving forces of the sure victory turned nightmarish defeat. Consolidating their forces at a camp near the Grand Canyon, Alaron happened to notice that this was just about the spot where Legate Graham had been executed, and there they stayed to reflect on their failure. Weeks would pass and more forces from across the Mojave would find their way into the encampment, showing the grand force that invaded the Mojave was reduced to less than a fourth of what began the battle. Each and every commander who survived the Mojave catastrophe, regardless of where they were during the invasion, felt like complete failures. As more time passed, there remained no word from Caesar until some news from the Mojave arrived in their camp saying he was dead. Although it was impossible to tell exactly how or when their emperor fell, a great sadness came over every surviving legionary and officer. When that news said the NCR was beaten at the dam as well, many didn't know how to take it, but many only heard of their emperor's demise, and many took their lives that day. Alaron considered taking his own life as well, for he was tremendously grieved by everything that happened on the day of the second battle, but the longer he looked at that blade on his desk, the more he thought. Hours, if not days, would pass as Alaron continuously looked at that blade, remembering the catastrophe and how his emperor had given his all. This catastrophe was nothing like the first battle at the dam. Not only was the Legion routed this second time, but the Legion was left without their emperor and without any direction. Many more stray legionaries found their way into the Grand Canyon encampment, and many of those would take their own lives upon hearing of the emperor's demise. At the same time, many of those who grew tired of the silence from their surviving legate and left in the night, while many of those soldiers went blindly into the west, ready to throw themselves at the city of New Vegas, or NCR. When all was said and done, the army of the Mojave was reduced to a sixth of what it was a few months prior, and Alaron continued to stare at that blade with Falco by his side all the while. As more time passed, he would feel the presence beside him and endure the silence of the legate, but the image of that blade and what it could be used for steadily began to morph into something else. After so long, Alaron found himself no longer looking at the blade as an instrument to ensure his death for Caesar, but he saw it as an instrument he used to raise his name above the ones who'd killed themselves for Caesar. Alaron watched that blade for hours on end as images of the countless times that blade clashed with Montano's flashed through his mind. Alaron thought about Montano all the time, wishing he was there in this defeat with him again, and remembering how they helped each other back across the dam in the wake of that first defeat. This time, however, Montano was not there. Montano was already gone, and Alaron was alone. Alaron felt more alone than he did when he was in soldier camp, stuck in the darkness of a bag and hearing constantly how useless he was. Caesar was indeed all. But Alaron remembered staring at the image of that golden bull on its blood-red background. The freezing rain poured down on his head, and the heat of the day incinerated his skin, but the whole time, His eyes were on the bull. No matter how many punches were thrown at him or the beatings he took that were his fault, Aileron would continue to stare at that bull and remember who picked him up each time. He saw that hand not in Caesar, but in the Lord Interfector, in Falco, and even in Montano. Aileron eventually picked up that blade, but instead of slashing his neck, he instead put it in his sheath and marched out of his tent towards the legate's domicile. Even though he would continue to be plagued by the failure and Caesar's enormous weight on his own mind, he knew that he would advance the bull till the day he died, and his time had not yet come. However, as successful as he was in this internal battle, his past would continue to plague him, and even the memories of what pushed him forward would become distorted as time went on and the world resumed without Caesar. Years would pass as the legate eventually took complete charge of the legion. With Legate Lanius at the helm, many followed him out of loyalty or fear, while Aileron did so only because Lanius was the man carrying the bull. Aileron's mind would remain blank as he battled his inner troubles about his own failures while the future of the legion came to fruition. Sitting on the mental sidelines, his body acted for him as the legate moved the legion east, harvesting even more as they moved and putting greater distance between them and the Mojave. More fractures in the legion's power occurred as the legate arrived in the jurisdiction of regional praetors who took Caesar's passing as a reason to take charge. But the reunification of the legion after Caesar was a process that would take a long time. One by one, these places in the lands of Caesar's old conquest fell to the legate, whether by submission or by force in this moving reunification. Flagstaff, Tucson, Circle Junction, Denver, all of them were thoroughly scourged by the legate, and Aileron did his best as one of the legate's own staff. As time went on, more and more legion settlements fell, and Lanius was dubbed Caesar Lanius in honor of the original Edward Sallow. Some saw this as a mockery of the original Caesar and fought back, but Aileron, who was later raised to the position of an elite, would silence any opposition while welcoming any who recognized the authority of Lanius into the ranks. Yet still, as Lanius took the legion east, the lasting impact of Caesar would remain on his mind while his body acted autonomously in advancing the bull. Despite this reunification of the legion under Lanius and abandonment of former territories, the growing factionalization would continue as the legion of old met with the legion of new. Aileron remained outside any of these conflicts, only doing what he was instructed automatically, but there still remained those who loved Caesar more than the legion, even in the ranks. As Lanius pushed the legion even further east, it became increasingly more evident that there were those who only followed Caesar Lanius out of fear or unenthusiastic duty rather than love. With more reharvesting, Aileron was approached by both camps loyal to Lanius and loyal to the old Caesar, yet Aileron again largely remained outside of this internal conflict and grumbling for focus on his own internal troubles. This issue only came to a head years later, when Aileron realized that his position in the new legion conflicted with his memories and legacy in the old legion. Many years after the failure in the Mojave, Aileron was present for the siege of Dallas. With the territories of Arizona and New Mexico almost completely abandoned, Aileron was on the front of another unknown land, doing the same work under the same banner, but the people in the ranks were not the same as the ones of old. Even if some of the faces were the same, the legion's glory days had long passed, and all that remained of those few men were the memories of that past life. Those memories haunted so many veterans of the legion, taking shape in a number of ways, and always leaving each one stuck in the present that didn't quite compare with the legion of old. After acting autonomously for so long, Aileron finally learned that even he wasn't satisfied with this new legion when he overheard a talk between two veteran centurions on the siege line in the lands of Texas. There on the central Texas front, Aileron listened to the onagers' continual thumping as they launched their flaming cargoes into the ruins of Dallas. How much time had passed, Aileron thought, as he sat in the communal quarters for veteran officers and stuck in recollection of the past. Aileron was proud of Falco for rising to centurion, but Aileron still missed him as his own duties across the perpetual campaigns took him away. Aileron thought about all that he'd fought through and all that he did to support the legion on so many nights, remembering the abandonment of so much glory in Arizona and New Mexico for this new front in Texas. Far beyond the desolate plains from Roswell to Lubbock, Aileron found it very hard to be proud in this new front. Aileron still missed Caesar terribly, and the memories of him naturally brought about more memories of the others from his past that had fallen. Despite his continuing successes and prestige in the new legion under Laenius, Aileron's mind remained stuck in the glory days of his past throughout the Southwest. Aileron realized just how alone he was mentally when even that past became distorted in the current day after hearing one of the officers across the communal tent say, "If it wasn't Caesar Laenius leading us, I would have happily abandoned the legion for a final attack on the Mojave long ago." Aileron knew these were two men from the camp that only reluctantly followed Laenius. Their hearts were still with the old Caesar. Aileron still didn't know what he was. The thought was one he spent each and every day trying very hard not to think about. Although there was no denying how big an impact the death of Caesar and the others he admired and respected wholeheartedly back in those glory days had on him. The other centurion, a commander he recognized as Centurion Franciscan, replied, "I could say the same." He sighed, and another series of onagers gave their sound, sending their flaming cargo into the next fallen city. The same officer resumed with even more solemnity in his voice, "How much has changed in these years?" Aileron agreed internally, hearing the first centurion, one he now recognized as Centurion Basilian, say, "Aside from Laenius, this banner now doesn't have the same glory as it used to. Not too many heroes these days. I believe the days of legends in our ranks have died with Lord Caesar in the West," said Franciscan. Both remained silent, and Aileron joined them in contemplation of the old days. The vast deserts and plains of the West full of so much honor, brought about by so much blood spilled in fallen heroes. All three of them stopped when their rose-colored lenses of the past finally reached the Mojave nightmare, and Basilian seized the opportunity to snatch that rosy filter yet again. "Remember Centurion Sereno? Who could forget," stated Franciscan. "He brought two tribes of the Colorado to their knees with only his lone century. A true product of the meat grinder indeed." "Or what about Aurelius?" said Basilian. The two officers on the other end of the enclosure went on to nostalgically remember the names of so many officers of the Legion, all of whom weren't there in the current day. Aileron overheard each of the names and all the deeds associated with such titles, and how they ultimately perished in the height of Legion glory before or during the enormous fall. Caesar, Lucius, Gula, the Interfector, Graham, Thericos, Aurelius, Lucania, Sereno, Talamon. The list went on in Aileron's mind as the pair of officers behind him mentioned every name Aileron had heard of, served with, and all the deeds associated with such names. Then Aileron started thinking about Montano again, but shook the thought out of his head because remembering him was pointless when the ending conclusion was the same. There weren't too many of these names in the current day. There might not ever be men like those again as the legends of past faded with the present and coming fronts. Time would bury so many of those names, and the thought of those names being forgotten as the Legion moved on in unexpected directions after Caesar was almost totally heartbreaking, as more distance was put between the Legion of today and the triumphs in the West. Aileron joined the Centurions in their shared sadness, despite how much time had passed, and the campaigns of today. Aileron remembered all of the names mentioned, and his mind ran over all of his own interactions with them, whether directly or by news of their stories. Aileron became even more depressed in the midst of this new campaign, when the height of his own glory was mentioned. A thought he was able to suppress was now unavoidable when Basilian asked his comrade, "Did you ever meet Centurion Montano?" "I hadn't," said Franciscan before adding, "but I'm certainly well aware of his feud with Aileron." "Why? Have you met him?" Basilian said, "Remember that story, Centurion, for there are many in the ranks today who don't know what kind of a hero Montano was. But yes, I have met him. I had the honor of campaigning with him against the Brotherhood not long after the fall of Dogtown." "What was he like?" asked Franciscan. "Believe me when I say that there was no finer commander of a century in any of our campaigns. What a fine warrior he was. It's honestly a shock to me that his feud with Aileron lasted as long as it did, As fine a commander as Alaron was and is, he didn't have nearly the same experience on the field of war as Montano did. After that, Centurion Basilian paused, and the two were caught in contemplation with Alaron still silently listening and stuck in his own world of painful recollection. Hearing those words, Alaron thought even more about Montano, missing him and Caesar both terribly. The war going on outside wasn't the same without him or Caesar, and remembrance of so many Legion heroes was a torture that both of them, except Alaron, didn't mind indulging. Finally, Franciscan asked, "What happened to Montano, do you know?" Centurion Basilian said with a voice full of nostalgia and sadness. "Last I heard, Montano fell at forlorn hope." Alaron knew the truth about his capture in that battle, but Alaron still had every reason to believe that Montano found the opportunity to take his own life at some point after Falco managed to escape. Not intending to diminish the honor of his rival, Alaron left the pair of centurions in the dark about the truth, concluding that Montano, despite what happened, deserved to be remembered like the hero of the Legion he was. Finally, Franciscan said, "I know Alaron is part of our force leading the assault tomorrow, but I wonder why he didn't die at the dam or fort. I heard he was leading the operation of Fortification Hill, but I'm sure his rival Montano would have given his all for Caesar as well if he were at the battle." He paused and looked to his friend. "You and I were bringing up armies from the east for the assault on Vegas when the second battle was launched, but still." He thought once more. Basilian interjected, "Don't you know that's what their feud was about in the first place?" And his friend raised an eyebrow at this before going on. "From what I heard, it only makes sense that Montano would die on the field before the Mojave Nightmare. Montano would have never submitted to anyone but Caesar, regardless of his commendations from Lanius and the meat grinder. Let's just say that it would be expected for Alaron to survive the day. As great a commander as Alaron is, I heard their last duel ended with Montano as the victor. I even heard it was settled when Montano held Alaron at blade point and made him confess that he never loved Caesar. Alaron was in the position of defeat at the end of that final duel after Graham's execution, but Alaron's confession to never loving Caesar was a total lie. It was, however, a lie that he didn't bother to correct. One way or another, the fact that Alaron was alive in the current day meant that it was true. Alaron felt physically sick when he remembered that Caesar was no longer part of this world, but he continued to tragically remember the fact that he didn't die for the emperor he so loved. Alaron was alive in the present day, and so many years had passed since Caesar's death. But what Alaron overheard from the officers behind him only solidified the message in his mind that he should have perished long ago. Lord Caesar would continue to haunt Alaron, and the nostalgic thoughts of Montano would always come crumbling down into depression when he was seen by others as the one who supposedly never loved Caesar. But why do I keep moving forward? Thought Alaron. The two officers eventually departed, and Alaron was left alone, facing the banner of the bull. With nobody of equal glory by his side, even memories of his triumphant past and legendary rivalry were stained black in the present day. Any of those few remaining familiar faces by his side, whether Gabriella or Falco, or even the centurions who remembered the rivalry, were tragically tarnished as well when the memory of Caesar's end and all that entailed came. Why Alaron moved forward was because of the bull, because of Montano's memory, because of the Interfector's memory. Why he couldn't find glory in the present was because of the fact he should have died with his emperor, a man his rival self lived for wholeheartedly. Plagued by the past and all he could have done, Alaron continued to advance the Legion forward, but regardless of the accolades thrown at him. His service to the bull would never be the same so long as the remaining legacy of Lord Caesar regularly whispered in his ear. Alaron didn't know of any solution to this problem, so it would continue to weigh upon him for more years to come. The assault on Dallas eventually occurred, and the Legion established itself a capital in a foreign land far from the lands of past glory in the southwest. With the complete destruction of the former city's inhabitants, the crosses were erected for those who defied, and work was already underway to clear the wreckage as something new was built out of the ashes of the old. Time would pass and more changes to the Legion would come, but Alaron's eyes remained on the bull. Alaron would later be raised to the position of a minor legate and would continue to lead the forces of the new Legion in more and more battles against new enemies. as changes to the Legion's entire structure came slowly with more time. Continuing to bear the weight of his failure to Caesar, Alaron patiently awaited the day that he would finally be free of Lord Caesar's grip over his mind. What that looked like, he didn't know, but leading in battle and crushing new enemies didn't help. The freedom from Caesar's grip and the end of that grim filter over his illustrious past was something that could only be obtained by the slash of a blade. Whether the slash of that blade was to his own neck by his hand or an enemy's, Alaron didn't know. But for the time being, he would continue to wait on that edge. Waiting to be pushed off, to jump, or to be freed, Alaron marched forward with that banner of gold and crimson, tragically leaving his glorious days of legend in the abandoned deserts of the West. Montano. Montano had left that prison camp along the I-15 not long after the legendary courier entered the history of the Mojave Wasteland. Boarding a train with over 50 other Legion prisoners, Montano was sent west deep into the heart of the NCR. Still more defiant than any NCR soldier was used to dealing with, Montano's continuous struggle remained rather tame when compared to the others in his POW group. As silent and collected as Montano appeared on the outside, Montano was anything but that internally. The only thing separating Montano from the others was his ability to see the futility in his protests. All Montano could do was silently bide his time and wait for the opportunity to take his own life, something that would not come. Montano understood long before the other Legion POWs that any of his attempts in the guarded and unguarded moments would only cause his restoration by the NCR's doctors and staff. And Montano bore the enormity of his failure that gave him the feeling of his brain's complete deterioration. The day Montano and his fellow prisoners stepped off the train, they were escorted through NCR territory for several days. Guarded the whole time, the NCR soldiers were under strict orders not to shoot the prisoners for any escape attempts, and so the chain gangs moved along. It wasn't the first time Montano was chained to a line of men and forced to march somewhere he didn't want to go. Montano, still unable to clearly remember his past, saw the unfamiliar images of his own past as he was escorted to a Legion soldier camp. Montano knew he wouldn't be entering a place that would completely alter the way he thought, or leave this place with a new supreme purpose. Montano was going to hell, a place where he'd be stuck with his own existence yet again, while the release he sought would remain forever out of reach. Upon reaching the gates to the NCR's prison somewhere in the state of Maxon, Montano was resigned to his eternity of self-hate, offering little physical struggle while his brothers around him continued to frenzy. There was nothing left for Montano to do. His mind was blank, too busy being crushed by the weight of his failure to Caesar to even notice the world around him. Just like Alaron, Montano would live autonomously, enduring the day-to-day of an NCR prison while the world outside continued and his mind remained elsewhere. His body would act for him as he instinctively searched for ways to end his captivity by lethal means, but knowing the side effect of his mental anguish included the knowledge that he would never be able to see it through. Days, weeks, months, and later years would go by, but Montano wouldn't be able to remember any of it. Each day was a blur as he battled his self-hate, and his body acted on Legion instinct, even after so long in captivity. Despite every waking moment being a reminder of his failure, and despite the calm nature of the man, it should still be mentioned that Montano was one of the worst prisoners the NCR ever had to deal with. Although similar things could be said about the other Legion prisoners, Montano in particular remained the embodiment of war in the East while confined in the heart of the West. He had a body that would act for Caesar unconsciously in the present, even when his mind was completely stuck in the past days of torturous glory. During the first days at the NCR prison in Maxon, Montano was one of the many Legion prisoners who almost immediately killed his cellmate. As it's been mentioned, Montano couldn't tell you exactly how it happened due to his blurred mind, but reality had a way of coming down when he saw the pool of blood around his cellmate's cracked skull, and his unconscious violence with the prison guards brought him temporarily back to the present. Continued defiance like this only meant regular time in solitary confinement. The tiny concrete cell suited him just fine if it wasn't for the terrible silence and the lack of ability to distract himself. Even then, this preference for solitude would fade with time. But for the first weeks and months of his captivity, he would remain in the darkness. It should be said that the NCR very quickly wised up to who exactly these Legion prisoners were, especially after so many murdered prisoners. Almost immediately, the NCR learned that having Legion prisoners share cells with NCR prisoners who were in there for drug pushing, drug-related crimes, pedophilia, and other death sentence crimes under Caesar's law was not the best idea. So, as the solitary confinement cells were instantly filled, construction was already underway to create a means of segregating these men from the wider prison population. Lacking the budget and time for official facilities, many scrap jail cells were erected in the prison's recreation yard for the Legion prisoners, reminiscent of the jail shacks at the train camp along the I-15. Even then, this did not work out too well when the cells were opened for recreation time with the other prisoners. And many riots occurred when the Legion prisoners stormed the crowds of inmates like a charge on the Colorado front. Many of these riots helped some of the captive legionaries reach the ends they've been seeking. However, this was corrected when the prison warden gave the Legion prisoners their own rec time. This too backfired in its own way, but was also corrected before Montano was finally released from his first stay in solitary. Upon release in their own rec period, the legionaries would immediately take the time to turn on one another. Many more Legion prisoners managed to kill each other before the tear gas was deployed, and all of them were detained. For a long time, the Legion prisoners would be confined to permanent solitary confinement in the prison yard under close watch, and only released one at a time to empty their waste buckets and stretch their legs. Weeks would pass, and many of the remaining Legion prisoners would undergo the same change that Montano did when he was finally released to his own cell within the prison yard. Those remaining prisoners would silently resign themselves to their situation, still attempting to carry out their duty to die, but knowing it would be prevented. Docility would come slowly with time, and acceptance would come in strange ways as more time passed. After the riots of those first weeks, the NCR military itself added more personnel to the prison, and regular visits from intelligence officers would take the prisoners away for interviews. To the NCR's frustrations, these interrogations still went nowhere, even as the captive legionaries ever so slowly grew to accept the situation. Each prisoner remained as defiant as ever in the presence of a profligate soldier or intel officer. Montano, too, was interviewed countless times over the last weeks of 2281, each interview being as fruitless as the last as Montano's body defied and his mind remained elsewhere. The only time Montano's mind was brought back to the present was during his last interview sometime after the start of the next year, when the intelligence captain said to him, "You understand that Caesar died, right? Caesar was defeated at the dam, and before you say anything else, you can rest easy knowing that we were beaten too. Still, we don't know if your legate is going to try to cross the Colorado at some other place with some of his holdouts, but your emperor is dead now, so you got no reason to keep fucking stonewalling me. For the love of God, give me something. Anything." Now Montano had heard from his armed guards, escorts, and prisoner staff that Caesar is dead countless times over his captivity. Some of the newer NCR soldiers at the prison even played an obviously fake broadcast announcing Caesar's death back in November, so Montano never believed it. Montano had every reason to believe that Caesar would take the dam. Even Caesar knew that back when he was alive. However, the possible reality of that intelligence officer's words hit Montano when more days and then weeks went by, and Montano realized that was the last time he was ever interrogated by the NCR military. For a long time, Montano, as well as the other legionary prisoners, thought this silence was a ploy on its own. But then more time passed, and then more, and then even more, and then months, and then years. Montano couldn't tell you when he finally came to the realization that Caesar wasn't marching west. He didn't know how long he was in captivity, but Montano waited countless days and months to overhear some prison guard mention that Caesar was moving on the NCR capital of Shady Sands. That day never came. Montano never heard about Caesar at the borders, heard about the conquest of Vegas, the fall of the dam, or anything. Montano was completely alone. The war in the Mojave was a long time over, and Montano would only subconsciously know the truth of what happened out east. Montano would never accept the truth that Caesar died. Even as the years passed and news of what exactly happened to the lands of Arizona, New Mexico, or even the Mojave never reached him. Even though Montano never accepted the death of Caesar, he began to understand a little more of the Legion's great fall when he found himself thinking less about his failure to Caesar and more about Aileron. The prisoner sat in his cell thinking for days at a time about his rival, wondering if he died in that. Whatever happened out in the Mojave, Montano remembered his last words spoken to Aileron from that seat inside McCarran Airport, hoping beyond all reason that somehow Aileron got that message. Aileron would never forget Montano, and Montano would never forget him. Montano couldn't know if Aileron kept true to Caesar in the end of the Mojave campaign, or if Aileron failed like he did. With no way to verify and no hope remaining, it was all true. Montano had no emperor to fail anymore. After enough years passed, the weight of his failure to Caesar subsided, but that didn't mean he would cooperate with anything NCR. All it meant was that nobody was coming to release him from this cell by death or otherwise. And the days became clearer. Montano was eventually able to see the present. However, no matter if Caesar was alive or dead, or whether or not the Legion had forsaken the California advance, Montano was still Legion through and through. With the new ability to see the present, Montano wondered how he could get free of this place and give the NCR what was due. After so much time had passed, the slow docility of the legionaries had taken over enough of them for NCR to offer them more liberties. Some of the less violent legionary prisoners would eventually be released to the wider prison population. And although it was true that some of them immediately used their new freedom from such scrutiny to successfully take their own lives, many of the remaining ones would happily indulge in the new permissions. This compliance with the captors did not mean that these men had forsaken their loyalty to their emperor, whether or not he was gone. It only meant that those men began forging plans for the future. Montano was one of the many POWs released to the general population who played the part of a frumentarius by being exactly what the NCR wanted them to be. Montano would be on his best behavior with his captors, still regularly burdened by his failure, but able to remove the weight of that burden with ideas about the future. After this release, Montano and many of his incarcerated brothers would form their own gangs or cliques in the prison yard, where the gangs or groups from the broader population minded their own business, planning how to get out, what to do when they get out, and how they'd protect their own. In the meantime, the legionary group was the same. Although the newly formed Legion clique would be more focused on how to inflict harm on their captors should their release day come. It wasn't normally common for the NCR to keep POWs in prison for as long as they did with the Legion prisoners. But the length of these prison stays primarily came from the character of these captives. The NCR originally intended to release these prisoners a few months or a year after the Mojave War was over. But as it was said previously, these prisoners were the worst of the worst. And so, prison sentences were extended. Not only this, but there were no envoys from the Legion to negotiate with since the retreat from the Mojave, and so the NCR didn't quite know how to treat these men. All the NCR could do was treat the legionary captives as a hybrid between standard prisoners and prisoners of war from a foreign nation. But the character and actions of these legionaries spoke for itself in the immediate months and years, and so the POWs would remain in captivity for constantly extended periods of time. However, it should be said that the prison warden and NCR itself did eventually take notice of the slowly calming nature of the POWs, and even though the prisoners had their sentences extended countless times. Many years had passed, and some citizens on the outside began wondering why the NCR was keeping these prisoners from a war that had been over for so many years. Although it is unknown when exactly the NCR decided to release some of the legionary prisoners, several years had passed and many of the prisoners had been on excellent behavior for months if not years by the time of the first releases. In fact, many of the guards at the prison had come to see the legionaries as some of the better behaved prisoners, with the guards of the prison constantly retiring, taking jobs elsewhere, or moving on with their lives. Even the military guards were largely removed from the prison as military efforts needed them in more important installations. After so many years, it is needless to say that the prison was being watched by many guards who weren't there for the days immediately after the POW's arrival. Not only this, but their excellent behavior in their cells and during their time in the yard even caused a number of guards to approach the Legion gang for assistance in putting some of the other gangs in line. Not ever intending to help the profligate prison guards, many of those in the Legion gang wouldn't say no to the permission to pummel an inmate with a record of child molestation or kill a troublesome member from one of the other gangs. Most of those prisoners in the general population still remembered the days when the POWs arrived and stayed very clear of any prisoner who marked their gray jumpsuit with the red X of an Eastern slave. With the excellent behavior of the Legion prisoners and their apparent truce with the guards, many petitions came to the warden's desk outlining the length of time these servants of Caesar have been incarcerated and explaining how well they currently behaved. Even though the warden was well aware of the types of men he saw arrive at the prison, word eventually came from the outside explaining the same issues. And the government began to see that perhaps enough time had passed for the POWs to finally be released. As preparations were underway to authorize the release of certain Legion POWs, nobody in NCR knew about the kind of pacts made at the Legion gang's tables in the prison yard, or why they were so well behaved in recent years. It is again unknown exactly when the first Legion prisoners were released, but it is believed that an estimated 15 years had passed. Believing that the extensions were largely exaggerated, or a product of leftover resentment from the Mojave Wars. Several of the Legion prisoners were released into NCR society, and the government would learn about the remaining loyalties of such prisoners not long after the first releases. Neither time nor incarceration removed the prisoners' instinctive desire to pursue their glorious end they've craved since falling into captivity. Those first released POWs entered society and immediately went on to carry out their plans to punish NCR for their capture. Countless hours in the prison yards were spent planning attacks on the NCR population from those prison tables, and the release of these first POWs saw to their plans executions. All across NCR lands, a series of brutal terrorist attacks ensued in the weeks after the decision. Whether it was bombings of NCR government buildings or mass shootings conducted on populated centers, there wasn't much to go on that would explain the series of terrorist attacks across NCR. It was only in the aftermath of each incident of terror that the end result was revealed to be the same. After the dead bodies of NCR citizens were bagged, or after the bomb wreckage was sifted through, NCR investigators would always find a lone man responsible. A man who could always be traced back to the NCR prison in the state of Maxon. A former prisoner who never had an official name other than a record titled something like Prisoner Number 1234 POW-LEG. Montano wasn't released during or after the first wave of terror attacks, or after the second, and by the time the third one came around, the NCR had already wised up enough to figure out where each terrorist came from. After even more extensions to his sentence, Montano was never able to act on his own terrorist plans, since all releases of NCR POWs were put on hold until more could be understood about the attacks. More time would pass, and the NCR would not release any more Legion prisoners for fear of what they would do upon release. One part of the public heard where these attacks stemmed from and suggested the death of the remaining POWs, while the other part of the public believed it was cruel to keep POWs from a war that happened so long ago under permanent incarceration. The latter was the majority, but even that group was equally puzzled about what to do with the 20-plus remaining Legion prisoners in NCR captivity. Many months of deliberation occurred in the NCR public, as well as the government, about what to do until about another year and a half went by. In the end, the NCR government lacked the heart to create a genocide of the remaining ex-legionary prisoners, and finally released their decision. Despite much protest from prior servicemen and women, the NCR decided to wash their hands of these holdouts from a long-ago war entirely. This final decision came when Montano and all his brothers in captivity were escorted out of their cells by NCR soldiers and chained to one another outside the prison gates. The remaining prisoners kept calm and wondered what exactly was happening while their minds still focused on their plans for the NCR should they get released. Days upon days passed, and eventually weeks, as the NCR military escorted these Legion prisoners east. Through the scorching heat of day and only stopping for a few hours at night, the escorts remained completely silent, taking these prisoners further and further east. Passing so many NCR townships and eventually entering the desolate wastes of the NCR southern frontier, the prisoners kept moving forward under silent escort. Eventually, the prisoners made it to where the NCR intended, and one by one the ex-legionaries stepped on the raft in the dead of night at an unmarked location somewhere near Yuma. Hastily constructed observation towers dotted the western side of the river, each one occupied by a team of ranger snipers that trained their sights on each column of prisoners. The raft slowly crossed the river as the night got darker and the moon sat high in the night sky. 20 minutes later, the ramp of the barge crashed into the sands on the Arizona side of the Colorado River, and the captain had all the prisoners stand in their rows facing him. The trooper escorts filed back onto the raft, and the captain told the remaining prisoners that they were officially free. With the point of his finger, the NCR captain told the prisoners that a half-mile away was a few crates of meager supplies, a few knives, and the keys to the shackles around their feet. As the legionaries looked in the direction of those crates, the captain explained that they were in Arizona now, and that any attempts to try and cross back into California lands would be met with lethal force by the NCR's forces standing watch at all known crossing points along the river. With that, the raft's ramp was raised, and the motor sparked to life as it carried the captain and trooper escorts back to the California side. The Legion prisoners had been officially marooned in the lands of their prior conquests, not knowing where to go or what to do. The chain gang shuffled to the spot the captain had told them about and found the keys to the shackles around their feet with minimal issues. One by one, the prisoners freed themselves and pocketed the supplies or claimed the miscellaneous clothing inside for themselves, before a long silence ensued. After release, many of the legionaries became panicked about being back in the lands of Caesar, and a few used the survival knives on themselves at long last. The remainder of these prisoners still had all the plans they wanted to inflict on California at the forefront of their minds and set off towards the north or south in search of some unguarded place along the river to cross at. All except Montano. Montano originally intended to depart with a group of terrorists to act on his own carefully formulated plan, but something in him changed when the officer explained where he was. Standing beside the emptied crates of supplies and amongst the bodies of those who executed themselves, Montano watched the group of terrorists depart, and a long silence kept him right where he was. Montano didn't know exactly how long he was in captivity when the first releases happened, or when he found himself alone in the lands of Caesar's past conquests. All he knew was that it was far too long. Montano had lived through captivity, a captivity he should have never endured in the first place, and never had the chance to display his supreme allegiance to Caesar. The weight of his failure hadn't come to him in several years for focus on how he could see his end by some means of terrorism. But it began to slowly come down again as he was left all alone in the desert of a land he used to know. At last it occurred to him, but why haven't any border guards found us? Montano looked around, seeing the distant mountains under the moonlight, and suddenly a strange sensation came over him. He still didn't know exactly how long he'd been in captivity, or why the Legion never marched on California. He thought back to the times that he imagined the prison getting besieged by Legion forces who'd see his liberation by death, and began wondering why. Why was it possible that my captivity lasted as long as it did? Montano thought. Just then, the silence ended when Montano heard the slow winds jostling the arms of a nearby saguaro, and Montano turned towards the east. Montano stared into the darkness of the east, and all the memories came back to him in a flash when he recalled those words from the officer saying where he was. The war drums beat in the distance amidst the clashing of steel, the thunder of guns, and the sound of a cohort's march. Memories of all the blood spilled, all the savages destroyed, all the heroes who rose from that furnace across this land, and so much glory taken by force in this land. Montano's mind recounted every victory he'd ever won in this desert, all he'd killed, all the honor brought to his name as well as Lord Caesar's. Just then, reality came back with another gust of wind, and the sounds of those drums, marches, and popping guns faded into the distance. All alone in the middle of the dark desert, Montano looked at the blade in the hand of one of those killed soldiers and picked it up, finally feeling ready to carry out his long overdue death. The man stared at that blade for a long time, ready to do the deed at any second, but wondering why he couldn't when suddenly another breeze came to him and he asked the world straightly, why? Why did Lord Caesar not reach the west? Why didn't the Mojave or Vegas fall? What could have possibly prevented such inevitable victory? Montano thought once more about the times he heard that Caesar died, and although he still refused to believe it, he looked down at that blade in his hands and remembered the man he relied on to steer the direction of the Legion plane, and said the words to himself. Haunted by all those memories of glory across the Southwest, he remembered his rival and all those battles that made him the failed legend he was. Don't you ever forget me or fail Lord Caesar like I did, Aileron. With the memories of that personal combat that drove him to so much triumph and subconsciously kept him alive the whole time, he put the blade in his belt and went off in search of some remnant of that past glory. Montano never made it to New Vegas or the regions of the Final Front. He couldn't bring himself to see what had come of Fortification Hill, Cottonwood Cove, Nelson, or even the Mojave in general. He only made it close enough to see the faint lights over the northwestern mountains, their existence signifying that the Legion was not its owner. Not knowing if he'd even be able to handle any more details about what happened so long ago, Montano went back south along the river. Passing the outpost at Dry Wells, the fortress at Bullhead City, and innumerable minor installations, Montano saw the wreckage of so many structures that used to be Legion, but not a banner was in sight. The whole of Arizona was almost entirely abandoned, the few inhabitants being wasters and the occasional band of roving tribals. The man proceeded to roam across Arizona without purpose, searching for traces of the Legion all across the abandoned lands, finding the region slowly returning to what it used to be before Caesar's grand unification of this wild territory. Each installation he approached only showed itself as a hollow gravestone of past Legion glory, as visions of what he remembered them to be ran through his mind and left him even more empty. Approximately one whole year passed as Montano aimlessly roamed, seeing the ruins of places like Flagstaff, Tucson, and even Phoenix, each one now home to small groups of wastrels or townspeople who didn't remember the Legion or what these places used to look like at the height of glory. Circle Junction was a shell, the forges no longer producing the weapons of war, and the same fate befell the innumerable outposts, soldier camps, slave camps, and logistics points across lower Colorado. Mesa Verde showed no signs of ever being inhabited by the forces of the meat grinder, and the road sat desolate as memories of long columns of crimson soldiers marching flashed through his mind. Montano then went south into New Mexico, not finding a trace of the Legion in any of the places he himself fought so hard to conquer. Not in Albuquerque, Santa Fe, or anything. He passed the desolate waste from Albuquerque to Roswell to Las Cruces, remembering the days that those very plains saw the rivers of crimson soldiers marching to and from battles, moving slaves and the spoils of war across the empire, bringing more glory to Caesar. Finally, after putting it off for already too long, Montano headed towards his old homestead between Gallup and Shiprock, seeing the ruins of many of those towns he personally ended in the wake of the first defeat at the dam. This trip to his homestead or entrusted lands was his last sight to see on his journey of lost glory. Montano knew that his land would have been long abandoned. The chances of finding his servants were almost zero at this point. Montano intended to see the final wreckage of his gifted lands and do what had been a long time coming. By this point, and after seeing so much of the Legion's glorious past erased, Montano had come to the conclusion that Legion glory would never exist again, and he would take his life for Lord Caesar. Montano was not surprised to see that his entrusted lands were a shell of what they used to be. His domicile shack was a crumbled ruin just like the barracks, slave quarters, and armories. But the only thing he didn't expect was the small glow of a campfire beside his time-ruined domicile. Montano remained out of sight, sitting in the shadow of the structure and feeling the weight of all that lost glory crush him into the dust. Completely defeated, Montano heard the loud conversation on the other side of the building, not surprised that the gifted home of a hero to Lord Caesar was now occupied by a group of raiders or settlers. He didn't much care if the gunshot would arouse the attention of the new occupiers of his home. Care for anyone not Legion wasn't something he ever considered even in captivity. However, it was in the shadow of that building that Montano heard one of the wasters say, Hey Lorraine, weren't you Legion or some shit? The one apparently called Lorraine replied, nope, I might have been born in it, but they abandoned me to my uncle long ago. Montano kept the gun to his head, listening carefully as one of the other wasters said, right, I remember you saying something about that. Why you running with us? Connections like yours could get you some sweet digs with the Legion out east if you play your cards right. Ha! Montano lowered the gun. Legion out east? He said softly to himself. The one called Lorraine answered, what, you think I could just stroll in there, say who my daddy was, and they'll make me the praetor of Imperial Dallas or some shit? He paused. Even if I could, I wouldn't want to. I'm just fine out here on my own. Nothing more had to be said. Montano left the remnants of his entrusted lands, disappearing into the darkness and heading even further east. Montano had to know for sure if the Legion still lived, if it was being led by Caesar, if the legacy of the West still remained in some new land, and see if Alaron was around to keep that glory alive. The Edge of Glory. Note, certain characters in this chapter are based on ones depicted in XCOM Anders' fic, The Lone Star Expedition. XCOM has been a tremendous inspiration throughout this fic, whether by character ideas, events to portray, and even just regular commenting that has been more than welcome throughout the story. That said, check out his fics if you haven't already and enjoy the finale to the story of Alaron and Montano. Approximately 20 years after Caesar's death, Alaron sat on the side of the long table, almost in the dead center between the two heads, with Legatus Barabbas at the head of the left side and Senator Quincy at the head of the right side. Alaron didn't like being so close to the middle and had nothing but disdain for the men of the Legion who labeled themselves senators. Why this meeting needed to be conducted with certain members of the overseeing Senate was just one of the many strange ideas added to Legion procedure in the recent years. Even though Alaron was wary of the Legatus Barabbas, the man was in charge of military affairs on behalf of Caesar Lanius in Imperial Dallas itself and was also the new Caesar's son. This son of the great Lanius emulated his father in battlefield savagery, so Alaron respected Legatus Barabbas for that, if anything else. Alaron looked around at the elite centurions and minor legates on his side of the table, and Alaron tuned out the ongoing words of the senators that he barely bothered to overhear. Thinking more about what he was going to say when it came his time to speak, he glanced at the commanders on his side of the table, knowing that saying words were the only thing that the senators were capable of doing. Finally, the senator to his right was done, and as usual, there was no input from anyone on Alaron's side of the table. Alaron felt the eyes of the senator beside him on his person, and caught one last look at the other commanders before meeting the eyes of Legatus Barabbas, who gave him a slight nod behind the golden bullhead mask. Alaron rose from his chair and began, "That is all well and good, Senator Hoovis. But I will suggest to you and your ilk that it is best to leave the handling of these San Antonio rebels to us, who've been in the field a while longer." One of the senators across from Alaron said, "Legatus Alaron, you must understand that." The speaking senator froze as Alaron met his eyes. That senator looked to the son of Lanius for assistance when it came to one of his commanders, but the look from the monster called Barabbas only made the senator shrink into himself. Alaron continued, "As I was saying, I agree with my primus, Legatus Barabbas here in his assessment of the strategic outcome should we do nothing. The war against those sons of Dixie, or whatever they're calling themselves, remains an ongoing focus of the Eastern Front. If we don't squash the rebels immediately, they will only drain our resources further when they could better be utilized in the East before the Antonianites have time to fortify themselves." Senator Quincy politely said, "Legatus Alaron, the way we deal with rebels in our territories is of the utmost importance." Alaron listened out of duty. The handling of insurrectionists is an ongoing problem since the end of Lord Caesar. I understand that some of you commanders in the field still long for the days of old and wish to deal with those who defy us in the old way. But the changes to the bull only occurred due to the hardships of keeping our forces united. "What is your point?" demanded Alaron sternly. Feeling slightly belittled from Alaron's coarseness, Senator Quincy continued, "It means that it is in our best interest to make terms with rebels like those of San Antonio. Hearing them out and showing that Caesar Lanius can be reasoned with will only prevent future insurrections. A short silence lingered as many of the commanders at the table considered the old ways of dealing with insurrectionists, understanding their concerns with the changes, but still seeing the act of defiance as something that can only be squashed with the ruthless blade. The room still divided, Alaron felt the spirit of Caesar take him over as he said, "Capitulation will only ensure future uprisings if any questioners believe they can get what they want out of defiance. This is especially since most of these recent rebels are led by those stuck in the ways of the old. I, for one, like many of my brothers at this table here, cherish the glory of the past, and though I can tolerate the significant changes to doctrine over the recent years, I have to admit that this issue is one that can only be truly handled by the ways of old. Caesar Lanius of today and Lord Caesar of old are both correct here. This should have ended yesterday, so my opinion stands." "Legatus Barabbas," said one of the senators. "What has Legatus Lanius and his oracle to say regarding the new Antonianites' demands?" The monstrous son of Lanius rose in his golden armor as Alaron took his seat. "That is not her concern, nor is it the concern of Caesar Lanius. Both remain occupied with other matters, seeing to Scorpio's incessant demands regarding the other fronts." Another silence ensued, as all the senators and all the battlefield commanders within the heart of Imperial Dallas were left to handle the new insurrection on their own. Beyond the great halls of the Imperial Palace Council Chamber, the sounds of war echoed from the nearby arena amidst the cheering crowds. At last, there was not much else to say. All that needed to be said was said, and Senator Quincy at the head opposite from Legatus Barabbas said, "Perhaps a vote is in order then?" The notion was wordlessly agreed to by everyone present, and moments later, the insurrection in San Antonio was decidedly going to end by their complete annihilation. A few of the senators had been veterans of Caesar's army and took the side of Legatus Barabbas and the commanders like Alaron. As the other senators frustratedly resigned themselves to the determination, Barabbas rose once more and looked to Legatus Alaron. "Legatus Alaron, gather your cohorts. All respite for your forces is ended immediately. Prepare for march on San Antonio by the end of the week. I'll expect a full strategic overview of the city's bastions and how you intend to handle them by the time we arrive. I will be joining you on this march." "It shall be done, my Primus," said Alaron to Barabbas. Legatus Barabbas went on to outline the roles of the other forces in the capital's regional limits, and the meeting was soon dismissed. Alaron was one of the last to leave, waiting for Legatus Barabbas when he heard Senator Quincy say that he needed to speak to him in the hall whenever he was done. Alaron wordlessly acknowledged, and when Barabbas was done speaking with one of the elite centurions, Alaron approached Barabbas with a salute. "My Legatus, as part of a separate matter, I wish to inform you that I have word about a previous issue we discussed." The eyes behind the mask of Legatus Barabbas immediately shot to Alaron's. "Is it about her?" "That's a negative, my Legatus." Alaron paused. "I wish to inform you that I summoned the proper soldiers of enough renown for your personal guard. Heading this is Centurion Falco, who I'm sure you know well." "I know him well enough. His only rival in age is you, from what I hear, another relic of Caesar's glory days. Although I am appreciative of men such as him and yourself, I can't say I'm glad to hear of his summons to my guard, especially considering his troublesome mentee or nephew, the slave spawn who calls himself Scorpio." Alaron replied simply, "I understand your personal troubles with the matter and reluctance to accept a personal staff, my legate, but rest assured that Falco is one of the best men for such a position. You hadn't been born yet, but that man served under Centurion Montano all across the Colorado meat grinder. His record in war and time under my own staff will tell you that he remains one of the most competent commanders in the entire legion." Legatus Barabbas thought for a moment before saying, "I'll have to take your word regarding your preferred centurion's renown, but don't think I'm particularly interested in the stories of a dead era," said Barabbas. "Of course, my Legatus," said Alaron with a bit of discomfort at his commander's lack of personal admiration for men such as himself and Falco. "Either way, Falco's placement in your guard will only be of a great benefit." Alaron's commander only said, "I'll look into your new guard choices when we get back from San Antonio, but for now, go about your duties, Legatus. And when we form for march, place your detachment of Legio Amazonias at the rear behind the recruits. Those savage women will serve as excellent cannon fodder before the prime wave and bolster the recruits should we encounter any skirmishers in the San Antonio territories. Of course, my Primus, said Alaron as Legatus Barabbas exited the council hall. Alaron grinned to himself as he thought about those centuries full of women to be used in the fall of San Antonio. Although Alaron didn't like many of the changes, especially ones like implementing women in the ranks. He'd seen their savagery for the bull and was glad his legates saw their primary use in war as something to follow the recruit ranks when they weren't serving as the Oracle's personal protection. Alaron stood in that council hall listening to the distant clash of steel from the arena outside and realized he'd been standing there long enough. Suddenly, he remembered he supposedly had to meet with Senator Quincy about something, and Alaron rolled his eyes knowing it was just something he had to do and left the hall. Upon stepping outside, Alaron instantly saw Quincy standing beside a column and talking with a couple of the other senators when he noticed Legatus Alaron. Legatus Alaron, over here, said Quincy, and Alaron approached while those other senators departed. Stepping before Quincy, Alaron demanded, "What is it?" The senator immediately began in a tone that Alaron already disliked. "I just wanted to inform you that I was not pleased with the way you—" "Stop," ordered Alaron, and Quincy froze at the sinister face of the minor legate. Alaron intended to end this before it began. If this is about my words in the meeting or the tone of them, I won't hear it. The end result was inevitable, and you know I'm right. There is no dealing with rebels like the ones down south by any other means than the ways of old. Men like you have changed enough about the Legion, and although I will listen to you only out of duty to the bull, I will not stand here and be lectured by someone who's never seen the highest point of Caesar's glory. You were brought into your position to fill a purpose, men like me, and all the other commanders in that room cannot be bothered to, for focus on the fronts. You do your little governing across the territory and leave the matters of the field to us. After the rebels have been slaughtered, you can do your legislating for whoever survives the war, but until that happens, you will not speak to me. Understood? The senator scowled and took in Alaron's words. A brief silence ensued until Quincy's only reply was a short scoff before he said, "Legatus Alaron, you truly are one of a kind. The last of a breed that should have been killed out in the Mojave." "Careful, Senator," said Alaron coolly, ready to kill the man and apologize to Caesar Lanius himself later. Quincy took the verbal warning, but still felt the need to add a final word. With another scoff, Quincy said, "I've heard of your little tale from back in the day, but just remember that soldiers like you are on their way out. There aren't as many legends these days, and I say good riddance too. The sooner men tied to superstitions like you are gone, the sooner we can turn the bull into something that will long outlast Caesar of old, as well as Caesar Lanius." Alaron felt his hand drifting to his blade, and the senator continued his self-righteous lecture despite Alaron's warning. "When the Antonianites fall, you will be sent to yet another front, and—" Just then, Alaron was rescued from having to kill the senator by a slave of the palace stepping forth and saying, "Legatus Alaron, there's someone looking for you in the central hall." Alaron knew the servant, and the senator silenced himself before Alaron asked the young slave woman, "Who is it?" "I do not know, Master Alaron," said the servant. Alaron was going to ask if it was an emissary from one of the enemies in the east, an envoy from San Antonio, a messenger from the field, or one of the countless bureaucrats across Texas that constantly ask for things from him. The servant went on, "But the guards have not restrained him, and his only demands are an audience with you." "Anything else this stranger demands?" inquired Alaron, splitting his mental attention between thoughts about the awaiting stranger and the irritating senator still standing there. The servant searched her mind for something else to satisfy the legate's curiosity, but could only say, "I unfortunately can't say, Master Alaron." Although it appears that the veteran sentries who allowed his entry are familiar with him, Alaron took this in and was even more curious about who this stranger was. Either way, Alaron still had to deal with the senator before anything. "So," he said to the servant woman, "I'll be right there. You may proceed, servant." He paused, remembering some of his personal affairs that needed attention. "Also, while I have you, ensure Clara and Raquel have seen to the concubines of Legatus Barabbas if they haven't already. Tell Clara to handle Chesley in particular if she remains troublesome with the others. And lastly, Stop by my quarters to see if Gabriella or the children need anything once you've seen to the remainder of your current directives." "Right away, Master Alaron," replied the slave before leaving with a bow and proceeding down the halls. Alaron, at last, returned to Quincy. "As for you, I suggest you forget whatever you were going to say. The fact your guts aren't already spilling onto the floor for what you previously said is a mercy you should thank the Lord Interfector for, not me." "Who's that?" asked the senator before Alaron removed his blade and caused the man to trot away in fear. As the man fled, Alaron reminded him not to speak to him again, and Alaron sheathed his blade. Turning towards the grand archway to the central hall of the palace, Alaron walked slowly towards the grand archway, his mind running over everything he had to do for Legatus Barabbas and all that was required for the march on San Antonio, when suddenly a stray wind came flowing past him from outside the open palace. The noise from the arena outside echoed quietly through the halls, and thoughts of the awaiting stranger hit him in a way that was almost foreign to him. When he heard the soft clash of steel, he wondered why it was so familiar yet so foreign just as he passed under the archway. Immediately entering the hall of columns, each one supported a hanging flag of the bull from an iron post, and Alaron turned his attention to the right. At the end of the long red carpet sat the throne that was currently unoccupied, and not seeing any strangers or guards, he turned to the left just as he stepped upon the carpet. There, at the far end of the throne room, beneath the rows of hanging flags was a man standing with his head hung low, flanked by 2 veteran centurions of the palace guard. Legatus Alaron stood in the dead center of the hall, himself being the only thing between the throne and the distant stranger. As soon as his feet sunk into his position on the carpet and his eyes locked focus on the stranger, another wind came through the hollow halls carrying a roar from the arena crowd, and the stranger raised his head. Without any word, Alaron ordered the guards to bring the stranger forth, and the 3 of them began to slowly walk towards Legatus Alaron. The stranger and his escorts got steadily further from the enormous palace entryway, slowly passing the columns and banners lining the great hall and straight down the crimson carpet. As the stranger drew closer, Alaron still could not make out the man, for he appeared unlike anything he was expecting. No, the stranger was not an emissary from the east, an envoy from San Antonio, or a messenger from one of the territorial governors. Not only this, but the stranger walked forward in an upright and powerful manner, as if he had complete control over his escorts who followed at a distance like the staff of a governor or centurion. As the man got closer, Alaron could see the stranger wore a tattered gray jumpsuit, with what appeared to be a large red X across the chest. The attire made Alaron assume him to be a slave or something, but that didn't explain the unspoken power he had over the palace guards, and Alaron never heard of a slave with that kind of attire. This assumption also didn't explain the withered combat harness, shin plates, and machete hanging from his hip that Alaron was able to discern upon approach. Alaron remained at a complete loss even as the stranger drew closer and closer, to the point he could make out a head of long black hair streaked with gray and an unkempt beard. At last the stranger was close enough for Alaron to make out several scars on a dirt-spattered face. But even this was unfamiliar to Alaron. The guard stopped around 30 paces from Alaron, and the stranger kept going until finally stopping no more than 10 paces from Legatus Alaron. The 2 stood across from one another at the center of that red carpet, and the silence continued as both the Legatus and stranger stared at one another without a word to be said. Alaron could not recognize this man, not by his outfit, by his walk, his scars, or even by his build. The man was roughly the same age as Alaron, both men long past what used to be considered their primary service age. They were both in their early 60s and looked as though they had each conquered the entire world in that lifetime save for one man. The deafening silence went on, and Alaron's eyes slowly went up the man's entire body, until finally landing on the unfamiliar scars upon the strange face, until finally landing on those eyes. Alaron stared into those eyes, completely captured by them, and the second he did so, he watched them narrow. The past hit Alaron in an instant. He had seen those eyes so many times before, during, and after so much vicious personal combat throughout their shared life. The life of warfare, the life of unparalleled servitude, the life of legend. Images of the past and all those brutal conflicts ran through the background of the world around those eyes, and Alaron felt the sensation of fear, rage, honor, pride, and blood-spattered satisfaction wash over his person as he found the words spill out of his mouth. Montano? Another brief silence ensued until it was finally broken by another distant cheer from the arena. Alaron, stated Montano as his eyes narrowed even more and his face contorted into the sinister scowl Alaron was well familiar with. Despite himself, Alaron saw the familiar evil and brutal power in his rival's eyes and nearly broke down in the confusing mix of elation and rage at unsettled business. "How is it possible?" asked Alaron, completely bewildered by Montano's existence and presence before him after so many years. Alaron had completely forgotten everything he heard about his rival after his sudden appearance disproved his long-believed death. So many years since the Mojave campaign had passed in an instant, and Alaron's mind scrambled for some kind of reason to explain the appearance when the sound of a tremendous clash of steel echoed in the distance. "I could ask you the same," said Montano, feeling his eyes cloud with confused happiness and untethered rage at the sight of Alaron. Neither man knew exactly how to handle this extraordinary event. Both of them forgot the continued presence of those Centurion guards standing in the short distance. You must come with me, Montano. There are so many here who," Alaron said before Montano's red eyes alone silenced Alaron. Another silence lingered in the air behind the distant cheer from the outside arena. Alaron looked into the eyes of Montano once more and saw all the tremendous pain and guilt of failure in them beneath the blind rage that drove both men onward. Finally, another roar from the arena outside echoed through the hollow halls of the palace before Montano choked out, "I'm only here for one reason, Alaron." The words made Alaron's blood freeze as he continued to stare in awe at the unbearable pain behind those eyes. Alaron had no idea what Montano was talking about, but at the same time, he knew exactly what he was talking about the longer he looked into the unbearable weight of failure in the familiar eyes. Sharing the weight of Montano's own pain, Alaron said, "I don't understand." Alaron deep down knew this was a lie, but the answer became all he could see and consider when Montano leaned his head to the side and took in the image of that vacant throne behind Alaron. The two met one another's eyes once more, and Alaron could only see the inevitable answer to all that pain in Montano's being when he remembered that throne behind him and who wasn't in it. Alaron felt the crushing wave as the memories of his own failure to die for Caesar shot through his mind. Montano saw this, and the two carried the weights of one another's pain in the silent seconds. Montano knew what it was like to fight in the final battle of the Mojave War, to not give his life on the field of glory during the sure victory turned catastrophic defeat. Montano understood all the ways that Alaron betrayed Caesar and all their emperor had done for them by continuing on in the following years, abandoning his ambitions by forsaking the West and fleeing east to forget their triumphant past. Alaron himself knew every single thing that Montano had gone through. He knew what it was like to be taken into profligate captivity, forced to live with his failure while his legend went on in a way he didn't deserve. Alaron knew what it was like to be revered as a hero in the surviving ranks of the Legion, a reputation he didn't deserve when the truth was that he managed to outlive his captivity long after his emperor gave his all. Montano and Alaron were one and the same. They were the mirror image of one another, able to live through the other's experience and sharing the same experience of failing their emperor. Both men remembered all the times they fought, how each one of their fights was in defiance of Caesar, as well as the bull, but necessary for pushing the two entities to so much glory, at the expense of ultimate defeat. Montano and Alaron completely understood one another. They were the same person, but the mental wars in both men would forever plague both, so long as a blade can complete the long overdue work. At long last, the plague over both men's minds was brought to the surface after resting deep inside with the passage of so much time. However, both men had come to the same necessary conclusion that needed to be done to free them both from the burden of so much tainted internal honor. That conclusion was spoken into existence with Montano's words, "I'm only here for one reason." There was only one conclusion, and with the two already well aware of one another's tragic existences, the end required mutual consent. After 20 years since the death of their true emperor, the duelists stood before the vacant throne and decided they couldn't put off the inevitable any longer. The painful silence was ended, and the charge towards the two's complete liberation began when Montano felt a lone tear fall down his face as he sneered. "You would be the commander that doesn't care Lord Caesar died." Alaron heard the words speak to his very soul, and knew they were true enough even when they came from a man who likewise failed Caesar. Alaron watched Montano's face twist into unparalleled anger, and felt his own undergo the same as he felt his blood boil and his voice bark in response. "Are you kidding? I loved Caesar with all my heart." Montano heard the words leave Alaron's lips, and saw the face that knew those words were truer than even Alaron knew. As both men understood one another's anguish, the fact remained that their consent to fate needed to be spoken into reality before it could come to fruition. Montano looked around the palace, seeing the vacant throne and remembering everything he'd seen since leaving the prison. All that glory from the West was forsaken, and the illustriousness of the new legion and all the changes since Caesar passed hit Montano in a way that didn't quite compare with the prestige of old. "You did you?" choked out Montano, remembering all Caesar had done for himself and his other self. "I don't even recognize this legion of yours. All of you here today are traitors to Caesar." Montano gestured all around the lavish palace, pointing to the guards who couldn't intervene for the life of them. Alaron felt the words hit him even harder than the previous ones, but the accusations caused Alaron's instinctive response for his love of the bull. "It's been so long, Montano. Why are you even here if you no longer love his legion?" Immediately Montano screamed, "I love the legion more than anything, but I loved Caesar even more than that." Feeling Montano's pain, Alaron shot at Montano's own spirit. "Why didn't you take your own life then?" Such a thing is beyond uncharacteristic for the legendary Montano. Alaron knew the reason why. He lived it himself vicariously even as he screamed those words into Montano's eyes. The words still had their intended effect on Montano's soul, causing him to shout what Alaron already knew. "I couldn't. Do you know what my life has been like these past years?" Alaron did, but hearing the broken man speak it pierced both men equally. Still charging toward their ultimate fate, and no matter how painful it would be, Alaron pressed on. Why not after release then? Once more, Alaron understood why and knew exactly what Montano would say. As much as it hurt Alaron to harm his rival in such an internal way, he knew the pain he'd received from Montano's response was necessary to reach the ending both men were long destined to come to. Alaron watched Montano gulp, and another painful tear broke from his eye as his face showed he was more than ready to burn the entire world for his dead emperor. Montano answered this question knowing the harm it would have on Alaron's own pain. "I had to see how false those profligates were. See that Caesar, the legion, still lives. But even those wretched creatures were right, and now I'm disgusted. I don't see warriors of Caesar. I see a nation of cowards who failed him at the dam and then gave up. You retreated from the Mojave, from Arizona, from so much honor and victory from so many fallen in the West. What I see are cowards that feign their loyalty to save their own skins and abandon everything Lord Caesar taught us." Alaron felt his hand drift to his blade, and there it stood as he heard the accusations of Montano speak their truth into their shared mind. Alaron awaited the reminder of the lesson both men unconsciously lived their entire lives based on, a lesson that the bull couldn't speak where Caesar could, a message Caesar embodied by his own sacrifice at the dam. Montano spoke this lesson for the hearts of Alaron and himself equally. This world has only two options for the Holocaust survivors to pursue: a glorious death or a pointless, withering, slowly fading life. The lesson sunk into both men before Montano's hand rested on the hilt of his blade as he roared the option all those fallen men across the West who called themselves Legion chose. Life is never worth choosing over the glory that comes from dying in pursuit of triumph for a master like Lord Caesar. The reminder of that lesson, and how both Alaron and Montano failed to live up to it, nearly brought them to their knees in total defeat. Alaron wobbled in place and Montano did the same. Feeling the admission nearly kill them both, Montano the speaker stood himself even more upright, knowing he'd make up for his failure to live up to that spoken demand by what he'd do next. Alaron tried with all his might to keep himself up, seeing the entire lavish palace around him crumble into dust with memories of the West and so much pride in their emperor. Alaron felt himself hunch over, the world outside disappeared, and he spat the blood from his tongue onto the patch of carpet he stood upon, before looking up to see the mess that was Montano towering over him. At last, Montano, and all he stood for as the total embodiment of vicious war and blind hate for all who opposed his emperor, looked at Alaron with his blade drawn as the final word came pouring out of his mouth with a river of blood. This legion you have here is a charade without Caesar, so here I stand, on the edge of glory, and I'm more than ready to dive straight into the depths of eternity and bring you with me before you sully Lord Caesar's creation further. The words echoed 1,000 times over in Alaron's mind as he looked up at Montano, following the tip of the blade to the wicked and tragic face holding it. Alaron ever so slowly stood himself back upright as his hand reached for his own blade, when suddenly, the real world came back in an instant. The reminders of the past and all that glory flickered across his vision when he caught several glimpses of the present world and what was happening. Alaron used all his might to break from his lock on Montano's being and caught sight of what was around him. A crowd had formed in the central hall and throne room. Alaron could see the 2 centurions of Montano's escort as well as several other palace guards, keeping a half-ring of others at bay. Amongst the crowd, Alaron saw the faces of several servants he knew, as well as senators who were drawn to the hall by the shouting. All of them might have been 1,000,000 miles away, save for the faces of Gabriella and Alaron's own 2 children, the young Maximilian and Aurelia. As much as he was proud of his boy and loved his girl, he knew their existence was a byproduct of his failure to die for his emperor. Alaron saw their faces like the terrible reminder of failure they were when he remembered his love for his rivalry, and the thought was just enough to make his head turn back to Montano. Although the present attacked Alaron in a different way, for as he turned his head, he caught the sight of Clara and Raquel, whom Alaron had done his absolute best to treat accordingly out of the utmost respect for Montano even so long after believing him dead. Remembering the former master who Clara and Raquel both served, their appearance reminded Alaron of Montano's newly discovered existence in the present day. As Alaron returned his focus on the tragedy of Montano, Alaron could see how those eyes couldn't even see his former loves, even if he wanted to. Montano's whole being was focused entirely on the man at the end of his blade. Alaron met those eyes in a new light, as awareness of the present audience flickered between the images of past glory, prompting Alaron to finally say in defeat, "Montano, we can use soldiers like you." Hoping Montano could read the message behind his words, Alaron could see that there was absolutely nothing that could free Montano from the glory of the past and ideals of retribution in the present day. Montano's eyes continued to pierce Alaron's soul. Not the present or any who stood in it could distract him when Alaron was all there was in his world. Another tear fell from Montano's face as his voice roared its response with all the triumph of the West and glory of all who'd fallen for Caesar. "Draw your weapon, Alaron. This is our last fight." This was it. The lingering past disappeared in a flash. The words entered Alaron's mind, and the legate of today rose with his blade drawn, while the most blood-curdling war cry echoed throughout the whole world. Steel met steel, and the roar of the crowd outside grew amidst the new fight for the honor of the fallen emperor and the glory of his lasting creation. Seconds turned into minutes, and the world outside their fight might as well have not even existed. The guards of the palace kept the crowd of senators and servants at bay. Gabriella shielded the eyes of her and Alaron's children while pleading for him to see reason. Clara, too shocked by the appearance of her long-dead master and lover, fainted into Raquel's arms. The senators were too confused about what man could have caused the calm and collected legatus Alaron to turn into the rabid beast, and ordered the servants to fetch other guards. More guards would come only to help keep the crowd clear of the fight, too entranced and fearful of the brutal display to try and stop it. All were in complete awe of the spectacle. The legatus Alaron was not identifiable to anyone there by anything other than the uniform he wore, but not even that could help discern who was fighting who as the battle in the throne room and central hall went on and on. Within 5 minutes, Alaron and Montano were both so bloody and mangled that the two no longer resembled humans, and that's because they weren't. Neither Alaron nor Montano were men in this final battle between the columns and beneath the flags. There before the vacant throne where Lania sat, the Caesar of today. This fight was not between two men. It was between two legends, who both battled for freedom from their old emperor's grip over their entire beings. That freedom could only come with the clash of steel, and only enter them when enough blood was spilled. Montano and Alaron slammed, hacked, and stabbed at one another endlessly, landing blows, blocking others, and the maniacal screams continued to echo throughout the entire wasteland. The savage and glorious display took them all over the hall, leaving puddles of blood staining the carpet and spattering it all over the columns as the fight continued in the most terrible of ways. One would never have guessed that either man was in their 60s, that one had been in prison for decades, and the other led troops from the rear lines. These two legends fought with the entire spirit of the legions past, taking them all over the grand hall. Not even exhaustion, age, or thirst dared to interfere with the fight. The elements of the world were far too fearful of the spirit of eternity in both men's souls. The only thing that could stop the fight was what honor, glory, and fate would decide. As the minutes dragged on and the mutilation continued, more blood would saturate the hall, and the power of the fallen emperor would grow and grow with each clashing of the blade. It is said that by the 10th minute, Alaron had managed to get his blade stuck in one of the concrete columns. How that was even possible is unknown, but there was no logic or reason that could explain the terrific fight. The blood-covered figure said to be Alaron worked to remove his blade only to dodge and deflect the endless attacks of Montano, before finally abandoning his weapon and dragging Montano down to the carpet, knocking the blade out of Montano's hand as he fell. There on the carpet before the short steps up to the throne, Montano and Alaron both mercilessly pummeled one another as the agonizing and psychotic screams of carnage grew louder and louder. With both men covered in each other's blood as well as their own, the savagery continued. Heads were slammed into the stone steps, the cracking of bones echoed through the halls, and nobody could tell who was who as the lifeblood continued to decorate the throne with each blow. It was again completely unknown who was who not long after the 15th minute, but all who saw the blood-soaked monsters of legend that day could not tell who fate decided upon when the savagery at the steps ended with one of the figures crawling away. As the audience watched one of the figures crawl across the carpet towards the blade of Montano, nobody could identify who it was or who the one crawling after him was. Neither could be distinguished by their shouts, their grunts, or their appearance when the spilling of so much honor showed both men as one and the same. Victory could have been either's, even as the one grabbed the blade, and the fight continued. The fight went on with one armed and the other not, but not even the one with the weapon held an advantage. More servants and guards entered the hall, and where Lanius, or the legatus Barabbas, was during it all remained unknown. But it is believed that their missing presence was intentional for some unspoken reason, especially when this fight had no business in the present since it was for the glory of the past. Either way, none of the new arrivals even needed to question the scene when they were rendered speechless by the blood-covered hall and the two monsters battling before the throne. The 20th minute had arrived. Neither had let up in even the slightest, but enough red was spilled from both men for fate to come and determine the victor. With both men still completely unrecognizable, the end had come when one of the men shattered the arm of the other for the 4th time, ripped the blade from his hand, and was knocked to his knees. Both were caught in one another's grips, but one was on his knees, and the other stood over him with the blade raised above his blood-soaked head. The two breathed heavily, unable to see one another through so much red dripping down their heads, and the opening of so much flesh left both men totally indistinguishable even from one another. At last, fate had determined who was in whose position when the kneeling man spat a torrent of blood from his mouth and sputtered, "You got me, Alaron. Finish the work." Alaron held the blade above his head, looking down at the mutilated Montano as he breathed in and out in the ensuing silence. With one hand on Montano's head of hair and the other on the blade, Alaron wiped the blood from his eyes on his shoulder. Although that barely helped him see any better, it was enough for him to see some of the crowd beyond his rival of legend. As the blade hovered over his head, Alaron looked into the face of Montano and met those eyes, seeing the ongoing pain behind so much blood. After a series of heavy breaths, the present day flashed before him once more, and Alaron spat the blood from his own mouth before breathing out. "I don't want to kill you, Montano. The fight, it's over." The world beyond disappeared yet again, and even though the silence before Montano's response was less than a few seconds, it felt like an eternity. The world sat silent as the grave until Montano finally replied in complete agony, nearly bursting with tears. "You have me in your grasp. Kill me, Alaron. I can't live in a world without Lord Kaisar." Alaron met those eyes beyond the dripping of so much blood, seeing the tragic being in Montano's existence as well as his own. The words from Montano could have killed Alaron himself if something hadn't changed in him where it didn't with Montano. Somewhere along the line, their minds went two different ways, and even though the two men were each other's reflections, Alaron could see the enormous void left by Kaisar in full clarity as he looked at Montano. Alaron still missed Kaisar more than almost anything, even more than the Interfector, and so many others who'd fallen for the bull. Alaron had no idea how he could continue in a world without Kaisar or his rival, but Alaron knew the answer when he remembered how he got by before Montano's arrival. Maybe it was the bull. Maybe it was keeping the memory of men like Montano and the Interfector alive, but Alaron had done it before when he believed that Montano had perished long ago. Either way, Alaron continued to meet the eyes of Montano, feeling as though he were about to slash his own neck should he carry out Kaisar or Montano's demand. Alaron would miss Montano terribly, just as he had when he believed he was dead the first time, but he stood in the position of victory with the knowledge that life past Kaisar and life past Montano was possible. As difficult as it would be to go on, Alaron, in the most merciful act he's ever done, granted Montano's wish and killed the part of his own self that loved Kaisar so much. As Montano slumped to the floor, Alaron felt the blade fall from his hand, and the world without Montano or Kaisar came slowly back. The crowd stood in total silence there in the hall, watching the blood-covered legatus Alaron slowly shuffle out of the hall. Many followed Alaron at a distance while others gathered around the body of Montano, and those who followed the surviving duelist wondered where he was going until they followed him to a terrace overlooking the arena and the setting sun. There in the light of the setting sun and beneath the distant roar of the arena crowd, Alaron collapsed to his knees and cried inconsolably for the first time in his memorable life, officially free of Kaisar's grip over his mind. Gone but never forgotten and missed beyond all reason, Alaron said a solemn goodbye to the part of himself that loved Caesar so, before standing himself back up and returning to the great hall where he personally wrapped the body of Montano in the flag of the bull. As the world began to slowly resume spinning, the servants began cleaning up the mess, and Alaron carried the wrapped body of Montano to a grave outside the imperial palace in Legion-occupied Dallas. Alaron would often visit that grave in the coming days and years, each visit with his fallen rival reminding him that whether his actions past or present were for the Kaisar of today or of the Legion itself, everything he did was out of pure loyalty to the most powerful on this earth and all the glory associated with such monoliths. All those victories of the past put Alaron and Montano on a path they each so loved, a path they knew led to a spectacular end that would only bring prestige to something greater than themselves. There was no better example of this ultimate sacrifice in pursuit of enormous honor than the dead body of Montano, who died solely out of love for Kaisar in battle against his other self. How Alaron was different, even he didn't know, but Alaron still lived. Alaron lived a life parallel to his rival that taught him a new outlook on the world he shared with his fallen rival. The surviving man continued on, living with that different outlook but continuing on the same path as his fallen brother. That goal of an illustrious death would come with time, but the path they shared and the path that Alaron continued to walk put both men and so many others right on the very edge of something so triumphant and grand before the final leap. That last place before the final leap sat on the point where a life of incredible service met with the glory of eternity and could only be arrived at by walking that path, no matter how long it would take or how different their view from it was. Walking the path Montano and Alaron both walked meant living fanatically with all your physical, mental, and spiritual being in pursuit of that victorious demise for the honor of the most powerful, and meant that the men who walked it would be absolutely ready to dive headfirst into eternity, always ending at the place where a life of war stared unflinchingly into the eternal depths. All the legends from Alaron's past had already made the leap, but even though Alaron was currently alone at that place, the life he lived and the life he would continue to live would keep him ready to leap at the proper moment. Forever remembering the heroism of his rival self and all they fought through, Alaron would live on, ready for the day that he would follow his rival's example and make the final step. That life he lived and the place he'd stand till the day he would make the ultimate leap into glorious eternity is known by all who fell and all who fought for the monoliths they served as the edge of glory. End. Seriously, thank you so much for listening to this story, especially big thanks to those who made it this far. I sincerely appreciate you and hope you enjoyed it. I'm planning on taking a bit of a break from YouTube just for a bit to finish the story I started on the site in the description below. Once again, thank you so much, and please leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed the story. And follow me on the site I write for if you feel like reading some of the stories I may decide to eventually upload to YouTube. Oh, and let me know in the comments or on the Fanfiction website if you think I should upload my long author's note for this story. It just has various notes about why I wrote this, what inspired me to do so, covers some themes, etc. Again, thank you so much, and take care for now.